Hello and welcome back to UML Operator Channel. And in this episode, this is part 3, where we're building a reusable concept of operations document from a framework. And the framework we're going to choose is TOGAF, the Open Group Architecture Framework. There are many that are out there in the industry. We've recently used AutoSAR for the automotive industry, but we have used many frameworks. I primarily use the Open Group Architecture Framework, or TOGAF, in our implementations. Now, I'm going to be using ArchiMate, which is from the Open Group Architecture Framework, for this demonstration. However, when we actually are doing our modeling, we're just going to use basic UML and activity elements to keep the building of the artifact as simple as possible. So let's get started. First, let's do a refresher on the concept of operation. So the ConOps, or concept of operation, is a high-level, plain language description of how a system will be used from a user's and stakeholders' point of view. This is why we like to use TOGAF, because it does a very good job of views, concerns, and viewpoints. It explains what the system is expected to do, how it will operate, how people, processes, and technologies interact to achieve mission or business objectives. It is not a design document. It's a storytelling document that describes the system and its intended operational environment. Essentially, the ConOps describes the current problem or opportunity. In other words, the as-is environment. It explains the future vision, otherwise the to-be environment. And it defines who the users and stakeholders are. It shows how the system will be used operationally through scenarios. It captures operational needs, constraints, assumptions, and limitations. And it enables shared understanding among customers, users, engineers, and management. The ConOps is typically aligned with ISO, IEC, IEEE 15288, and the INCOSE Systems Engineering Handbook. So why use TOGAF? Well, we want a very high strategic, business-aligned architecture for designing, planning, implementing, and governing enterprise IT architecture. We choose TOGAF because it supports a architecture vision, business architecture, information systems, technology architecture, our roadmap, while something like AutoSAR in ConOps would be tailored for application software components, runtime environment, basic software methodology. The ConOps template would need to be tailored or fit the framework and industry the project is focused on. So while we're looking at the ADM, the architecture development method, we're going to be using ArchiMate, which is also from the Open Group Architecture Framework. And I want you to notice the colors here, that from the preliminary to architecture vision, of course, requirements management in the center, and all of this is iterative, to all the way through the wheel to the architecture change management is motivation. And business architecture is going to deal with a business layer, while information system architecture deals with the application layer, and then technology architecture deals with the technology layer. Everything else that we see here is implementation and migration. So it's very important to understand that as we move from the ADM and then map to the concept of operation sections that we're going to be dealing with. As we move through each section of the concept of operations, in this particular case to TOGAF, we're going to be utilizing the ArchiMate framework, if you will, to map to each one of these. So when we look at ArchiMate and we're mapping to each one of these sections of the concept of operations, we're going to be talking about how each one of these provides intelligence, I want to say, to each one of these sections. So when we're looking at preliminary, for example, in TOGAF, there are outputs that come out of the preliminary section, or phase. And then we go into architecture vision. We have output from that. And then as we go through the wheel, each one of these is providing output, which can be contributed at a high level to a particular section of the ConOps. Now we're going to be using activity elements to store our data, our intelligence for each one of these. And so you could certainly use any element type as you're driving your content that is going to be within the concept of operations artifact in the end. When we look at ArchiMate as an example, and you could certainly use ArchiMate, when we're looking at the business layer, for example, ArchiMate has various image types. This is basically model-driven generation from Sparx, representing an actor within the active structure concepts, representing business processes, services, events, representing contracts, and so on within the passive structure concepts. Each one of these start to make sense. So whether you're using a stick figure from a use case or you're using an ArchiMate element to drive your content and your intelligence, or you're using a class element or something like that, this starts to come together when you're getting into the application architecture from an active structure. Now, the active structure elements are entities that perform behavior, and the behavior concept elements describe what the action structure does. And then when we get to passive, the passive structure elements are the objects on which the behavior is performed. So this is ArchiMate. It's more complicated, and this session or this series is not going to be on ArchiMate. We're going to focus on simple UML elements to support your concept of operation. So now we can understand how we're using TOGAF, the architecture development method, to map to each one of the sections of the ConOps. And if we go into relationship view, let's just look at the ones that have relationship, we'll be able to look across the ADM and map to the individual sections of the concept of operations document. We are going to build a reusable template that can be used in any specific delivery need. So when we're looking at the specification view and the content or the objectives of each one of the sections, these can be tailored. And again, we're using TOGAF as our framework to any level of delivery, any type of engineering, from software and system engineering to AI engineering. We will be able to tailor the concept of operations or ConOps from an ArchiMate perspective, understanding the various layers of the architecture that we're dealing with, along with the motivation. So when we're looking at particular sections of the artifact, we know that the introduction is relevant to the motivation, and we understand what motivation is within our architecture modeling, and so on throughout all of the various areas of architecture or enterprise architecture delivery. All right, we're going to wrap up now in the next episode. I hope that this is all coming together for you and helps you understand what needs to be done when you're taking a industry standard framework and you're tailoring it to any level of architecture delivery. Again, whether it's systems, software, machine learning, and AI, we look to be able to build out an artifact that gives direction to each one of the sections and things that need to be accomplished when developing a ConOps, a concept of operations. So in this particular case, we're explaining what we're doing by each section, what the dependencies are from the frameworks to the particular areas of delivery within the concept of operations. So I hope that this will start to come together for you in the next episode. We had to break this up into multiple parts. And then finally, after part 4, we're getting into requirements engineering versus software engineering in part 5. So, and then we'll start to wrap up. We're going to be showing real world. It's a demonstration project, so we'll be using in this channel for our fictitious company called Arco. And you'll see the concept of operations or ConOps come together, as well as all the supporting artifacts. So until that next episode, happy modeling.